Good afternoon. I'm going to land on the ice. And in the Netherlands, I always feel at this point I should say I'm not Ben Saunders. I don't sing. I have no tattoos. But I do specialize in dragging heavy things around cold places. I'm also stuck. There we go. Now, before I go any further, I should point out if any questions pop into your mind at any point during my talk over the next 15 minutes or so, you can text, SMS this number with, I don't know how to pronounce that, Sherm? Is that screen? And then a space, and then your question. And I've got a great friend of mine, a Dutch friend, who's in the audience somewhere at the front here, Philip, who's going to come up and help moderate that at the end. On May the 11th, 2004, I was standing on my own at the geographic North Pole. That's the very top of the world. If you spin a globe, it spins on the two geographic poles, so it's where all the lines of longitude converge. Which also means that every direction is south. No matter which way you're facing at the North Pole, it is south. It's where the time zones converge, so it could have been any time I wanted. It was sort of every time at the same time, if that makes any sense. It was 24-hour daylight, so it's peculiar to tell. It's difficult to tell whether it's day or night. And I was the only human being on the surface of the Arctic Ocean, which is 5.4 million square miles, an area 1.5 times the size of America. I'd walked there on my own from the north coast of Russia, a journey of just over 1,000 kilometers in a straight line. It took me 10 weeks on my own, 72 days, and in reaching the North Pole became the third in history to walk there alone. Now, no one's done it since, and why is that in an age when more than 5,000 people now have climbed Everest? More than 500 have been into space. How come only 3 of us have skied solo to the North Pole? Well, the first reason is it's a pretty stupid thing to do. Clearly, I'm not an explorer in the Edwardian sense of the word. You know, I'm not skiing along, drawing maps, that kind of. That's all been done, really. There are perfectly adequate satellite images of the North Pole. You can find it on Google Earth nowadays. So I'm not really an explorer in that sense of the word. And the second reason it's a small club of 3 is that it's quite a difficult thing to do at times. It's clearly quite chilly. Minus 48 degrees centigrade was the lowest ambient air temperature I experienced. Theoretically, a wind chill of minus 60 or minus 70 degrees C. The North Pole is also in the middle of the sea. So if you want to walk there, you've got to cross the floating surface of pack ice that's on top of the Arctic Ocean. So there are no maps. The ice is getting thinner every year, so it's a journey that's getting harder and harder, and it's always moving. So if you're sleeping in a tent, then you wake up somewhere different the next day. It's an environment that is in a constant state of flux. It's also an environment that's home to the world's largest land-based carnivore, the polar bear. So it doesn't have a lot to recommend it as a sort of gap year destination or somewhere to go for a sabbatical. And I'm going to try and preempt the 3 most common questions that I get asked. The first one is why. I'm not going to answer that right now, but I will come back to it. The second question is, Ben, I've read somewhere that at minus 50, exposed skin becomes frostbitten in less than a minute. So how do you go to the toilet? Now, again, you've just had lunch, so I'm not going to answer that right now. I just want to sow that seed in your minds, and I will come back and give you some more detail at the end. The third question, what's next? How do you top that? I was 26 when I skied solo to the North Pole. A little bit worried I'd peaked a little too soon in my career. Clearly, there are only 2 poles to reach. So how on earth do you top that? I'll come on to that at the very end and give a sneak preview of what I'm planning a bit later on this year. But I'm going to talk about one expedition in particular. Now, I've spent 2% of my entire life now living in a tent inside the Arctic Circle. 7 big expeditions, but I'm going to pick out my favorite, which was in 2004. And my plan was to go right across the top of the world, right across the Arctic Ocean, on my own, from the north coast of Russia, which is the top of that red line, to the North Pole in the middle, and then to carry on walking to the north coast of Canada. No one had done this, in fact, still no one has done this on their own without being supported en route. 2 Norwegians did it as a team back in 2000. They ran out of food a week before they reached the Canadian coastline. It took them 109 days. There was a doctor on the small ski plane that picked them up. He described them both as being 48 hours away from death. They'd pushed themselves to their absolute limits. Now, I never told my mum this bit, but this became my dream, to make this journey, but to do it solo, because no one had done it, and in fact, a lot of experts were saying it was impossible. Now, this wasn't my first expedition, but it was certainly the grandest one I'd attempted, and I set out in the spring of 2004. This is me packing, getting ready to go. This was 95 days of food. I'd fattened up. I'd put on 10 kilos, so I'm 10 kilos heavier there than I am now. And the journey started quite sensibly. There's quite a big support team. We had a film crew, that kind of thing, flying out through Russia with me, documenting the journey out to the start of my expedition. And beyond that, I was on my own. We flew British Airways to Moscow. That was fine. From Moscow to Krasnoyarsk, where there's this sort of 90-degree angle, we flew on a Russian airline. I don't know if you can read, but that was pronounced Crash Air. From Krasnoyarsk up to Katanga, which is on the north coast of Russia. No one really wants to fly there, so we'd chartered this pretty elderly Tupolev to take us up. We've stopped here on a frozen lake to refuel. The 2 guys next to the Aeroflot fuel truck were both smoking as they were refueling the plane. The stray dog you can see looking up the steps came with us for the rest of the journey. And our pilot, before we took off, said the next leg of this journey would take us 6 hours if we lived. We did live. This is Katanga on the north coast of Russia. That's about as light as it gets in the middle of February. The blob just on the horizon is the sun. That's about midday. The sun only comes up at about 10:30 in the morning and sets about 3 in the afternoon. The rest of the time, it's pitch black dark. It was minus 42 degrees C when we landed there. We were stuck there for a few days. Finally flew north by helicopter up to the northernmost of a string of islands called Severnaya Zemlya, and up to the edge of the pack ice. It was a 5-hour flight. We had 2 helicopters flying in tandem. You can see the first one in the corner there landing. We came and landed just behind it, and it looked and felt like a different planet. This was my 5th big expedition in the high Arctic, but the novelty never wears off, and I wanted to be an astronaut when I was very young, and we do have one, I think, somewhere here on the front row still. And I guess in some ways this is a way for me to get the same sort of kicks with a slightly lower budget and slightly less commitment. But it's an utterly forbidding, utterly hostile environment. It feels like you're not supposed to be there, and I think that's part of the thrill. We had half an hour to unload all my kit, say goodbye to my friends, do a bit of filming, bit of photography. The pilot did that. Everyone else climbed back in the door. The rotors started turning. Wham, the door slid closed. And I was alone. That was the last photo that was taken of me out of the window of the helicopter. And I don't think words will ever quite do that moment justice. The only thing I can remember thinking as the 2 helicopters started to take off slowly was having to stop myself, running back up to the helicopter, banging on the door and saying, look, guys, actually, I haven't thought this through. I'd been so busy, getting this enormous bream, this daft, impossible project off the ground. It had taken really nearly 3 years to get to this point of absolute 100% every second of my time, every calorie of my energy, every penny of my money, and then some. And I hadn't even taken a second to step back and reflect on the enormity and perhaps the stupidity of what I was about to attempt. And it hit me right then. You can see I've got 2 sledges at the start. I had 95 days of food and fuel. The fuel is for a cooker, so I can melt snow to get my drinking water. I was obsessive about saving weight, so I'd cut the labels out of my clothes. I'd cut the handle off my toothbrush. I decided to take 1 spare set of underwear for 3 months on the ice. So some pretty extreme measures, despite which I was pulling 180 kilos. twice as much as I weighed at the start of this expedition. And if I was showing off to a photographer, as I am here, right next to the helicopter, I could just about move them. If the ice was flat, I could just about move them. But if the ice wasn't flat, I didn't have a chance. This is called a pressure ridge, and we've got one behind me actually here as well. This is the most common obstacle I would come across. Often dozens of these every single day. They're a result of, if you get close to the Arctic Ocean, if you fly over it at a low enough altitude, you will see that it is not one big crust, one big sort of cap of ice. Often if you see on the news about climate change, you'll see a sort of computer simulated globe with a big white ice cap. Now, when you get close to it, you realize it's not one big sheet of ice. It's lots of sheets of ice, and they're all moving around constantly. The big sheets are called pans, and they're subject to the currents of the ocean, the wind as well, and the tides near the coastline. So you have these conflicting forces at work, and when these giant pans bump into each other, they crumple up, and you get a ridge. Now, it's a sort of vicious cycle because the ridges then act like sails when the wind blows. So the Arctic Ocean is getting more and more smashed up. It's thinning with each year. So it's an environment that's getting tougher and tougher to try and cross wearing a pair of skis. NASA described the conditions that year as the worst since records began. In fact, that record has been broken several times since. It's, in effect, getting worse every year. We know for sure that the pack ice of the Arctic Ocean has thinned 40% in the last 40 years. So 1% a year on average, it's getting thinner. For me, the thinner the ice, the tougher things are. Thick, old ice is safe and flat-ish. This thinner, newer ice is much more susceptible to being compressed. That's another average day. I think skiing to the North Pole is probably the wrong term. And the ice was moving. I never woke up, as I said, in the same place that I went to sleep the night before. And for 9 out of the 10 weeks I was out there, I was drifting backwards. And the worst day came about 2 weeks into the expedition. I got up in the morning, took my tent down, packed the sledge, started heading north. I did about 8.5 hours, put my tent up in the evening, and I was definitely going the right way. Pulled out my GPS to see how far I'd gone, and I was 2.5 nautical miles, 5 kilometers nearly, further south than when I'd started that morning. I still had well over 1,000 miles to go, and I'd done minus 2.5. So not the happiest evening in the tent. So it probably sounds like utter misery, but there's a wonderful quote. So a guy called Wilfred Thesiger, incredible explorer, he had a big thing for deserts. He said deserts were places that he felt were untouched by time or by culture. And to me, the Arctic Ocean has a bit of that. It's an incredible place. And one of the joys of being out there on your own is the knowledge that the scenery that you see is unique to you, because it will be different the very next day. So I've seen scenery, and beautiful scenery, that no one else will ever or can ever see. So that hopefully explains part of the thrill of it. After another couple of weeks into early April now, the sun is now up 24 hours a day, the temperatures are starting to climb, and I would start getting reminders that I'm walking over the sea. The ice starts to melt, and you get these cracks in the ice called leads. Now, I'd sort of pretend to myself that they were rivers that I'd have to cross, rather than cracks that were maybe up to 3 or 4 kilometers deep. If I was lucky, I could jump over little bits of ice like I can here. Other times, these leads were many, many meters across, maybe 100 meters or so across. I knew this was happening. I knew that water would be one of the biggest obstacles I'd face, so I had a secret weapon in my sledge called a dry suit, or an immersion suit. Completely waterproof, goes on over my ski boots, over my gear, means that I can actually climb in and swim across leads that I can't find a way around. One of the most frightening things I've ever done, partly because polar bears hunt up and down these leads, and I realized very quickly I was wearing something very orange in a very white place. And I'd sort of backstroke across, pull the sledge over, and I would carry on. Got to the North Pole on the 11th of May 2004. As I said, it took me 10 weeks to get there from Russia. A couple of near-death experiences on the way, and there is nothing there. There isn't even a pole at the North Pole. I knew that. It's sea ice, it's always moving. Even if someone left a flag, it would drift away. But I was still expecting something to look or to feel different. And it's like finding a bit of carpet on the floor. There's nothing to differentiate it. And I counted down the last few meters on my GPS. I sat on my sledge and I thought, well, I haven't really rehearsed this bit. And when I looked again, I was no longer at the North Pole. So I had to sort of reverse back and find it again. I thought, well, I've got to phone someone. So I pulled out my phone. I dialed my mum, first of all. I called my girlfriend at the time, and I called the chairman of my sponsor. And I got 3 answer phones. I eventually got through to my mum. She was in the queue at the supermarket, and I could hear the sort of boop, boop, of the shopping go. And my mum said to the girl, she said, "Oh, it's my son, he's at the North Pole." Silence. And then she said, "Look, it's a bit awkward, could you call me back?" And I hung up. And I just sat on my stage thinking, this isn't quite how I'd imagined this day was going to pan out. Anyway, I carried on for as far as I could towards the coast of Canada before things really got too dangerous to continue. This was taken a week beyond the pole on the Canadian side of the Arctic, and some pretty dangerous ice conditions. My team in the UK thought that we had a very narrow weather window and safest if I was picked up while it was still relatively safe. So they said, "Ben, can you see anywhere for a plane to land?" I said, "Well, not really." They said, "Well, the pilots need a 500-meter runway of flat ice, so could you have a look?" Anyway, it took me all night, all through the next day, to find a bit of ice that I thought was big enough. With my GPS, it came to 473 meters. And I'm thinking, you know what? There's bound to be a bit of leeway. You know, I'm not going to tell them it's a bit short. It'll be fine. 9 hours later, this tiny plane, little ski plane, turns up, flies very low over my runway, doesn't touch down, but it sort of skimmed over the ice, took off, turned around, and disappeared. And I thought, I've been busted. You know, they can't land. They've realised it's too short. They've gone to look for someone. There isn't anywhere else. I'm in big trouble. And the plane came back again and again, but without touching down, sort of skimmed over the runway, disappeared. And each time I got more and more depressed, more and more frightened that I was going to be abandoned to die alone in the Arctic. And finally it landed on the 5th approach, skidded to a halt before my tent. And I was, at this point, quite worried because I knew the pilot was called Troy. Now, I don't know if we've got any Troys in the room, but I thought Troy was quite a tough-sounding name, and a Troy that flew planes, landing on floating sea ice for a living was probably going to be quite a tough, hard man, and not impressed if I was crying, which I was. So I had to really quickly compose myself for Troy. And the door opened. This guy jumped out. He's about that tall. He said, "Hi, my name's Troy." The co-pilot was a lady called Monica. They were the least macho people I've ever met. Troy lit a big cigar. He said, just get in the back. There was actually nowhere else to sit. I've since learned this is highly illegal, but I guess you can get away with it in the Arctic. In fact, there was a third crew member called Rick. He was the in-flight engineer. Whenever there was a noise, and I bet you didn't have this on the space shuttle, he would climb up with a sort of and pull this pipe out of a barrel and stick it into another barrel. So they're refueling the plane as we're flying along. You can see Monica looking a bit worried. If I zoom in, you can see there's fuel pouring, spraying around the inside of the plane. So a pretty hair-raising flight, but one that left me with a profound, lasting impression. When you're standing on the surface of the sea ice, you only see one obstacle at a time, whether it's a ridge or a lead, one of these cracks. Only from the air did I realize quite how bad things were. Now, I'm not a scientist. I'm not even a sort of raving eco-warrior. I'm not wearing any hemp. I flew here to speak. I drive too much. But I am a layman that has been privileged enough to get to know this place very intimately for the last decade now. And it is clear to me, from my layman's point of view, I don't need to look at a spreadsheet or a simulation, that things are changing very dramatically and very quickly indeed. So that was the impression that's really stuck with me. I'm running out of time. Why? I'm not an explorer, as I've said in the old-fashioned sense. I'm an athlete. I'm interested in human limits rather than geographical ones. And I guess this really was a journey into my own potential as a human being. And that's something that fascinates me. I firmly believe that we all have enormous innate potential. And yet most of us go through life just scratching the surface, just doing 3 or 4 or 5% of what we're genuinely capable of achieving. So I wanted to try and test myself, go beyond my normal boundaries. How do you go to Lou? As quickly as possible. What's next? Very quickly, heading back to the North Pole. I'm trying to go back from the Canadian side. I got there from Russia in 2004. There have been several attempts, but no one's managed to get there solo since. It's getting worse every year. It was George Mallory on Everest in 1924 that coined the phrase, "because it's there." In my case, I think some of my motivation is perhaps because it's there, but not for much longer. These are a couple of satellite images. This is 2008, 2009, but you can see the scale of change. If I go back again, that's the maximum sea ice extent, that's the minimum. Every record has been broken continually for the last decade now. The scale and the rate of the melt each summer is intensifying. There won't be many years left where it's possible to walk to the North Pole. What's next? Very briefly, this year is the centenary of the first human beings reaching the South Pole. It was Roald Amundsen that got there, Norwegian team, using dog sleds, and they beat Captain Scott to it. The British guy, most of you might know the story. Scott's team were on foot, Amundsen used dogs. These 5 guys died on their return journey. All 5 of them died walking back to the coast. They didn't make it. This was 100 years ago. In some ways, it remains the most poignant journey of that golden age of Edwardian exploration, and it hasn't been finished yet. So that seemed like an intriguing challenge to me, to walk from the coast of Antarctica to the South Pole and back to the coast again. It's 2,900 kilometers. It'll take 4 months. It'll be at the end of this year. That's my website, bensaunders.com. I want to leave you with one final thought before I ask Philip to come up and moderate some questions. I have a school report at home that's framed above my desk, and there's one line that I like. It says, "Ben lacks sufficient impetus to achieve anything worthwhile." And in some respects, they were quite right. You know, I still haven't figured out what it is I want to do when I grow up. You know, I'm on my gap year. But I think if I've learnt anything in 10 years now of leading these expeditions, it is that no one else is the authority on your potential. That's my story. Thank you all very much. And Philip, oh, that's better. Can you hear me now? Philip is I would say, a 21st century phenomenon. I describe him as a good friend, but we'd never actually met until today.
First time today.
Yeah, first time we met. We've been exchanging emails and you know, phone calls and things for several years, but we've never actually met. Philip, a Dutchman who also leads Arctic expeditions, a few crossings of Greenland. Some big trips.
In 2007, I crossed Greenland from east to west, and in 2008, we did, together with 2 other guys, a south-north crossing from Greenland. We started in the south of Greenland and traveled 2,500 kilometers to the north side of Greenland. So also 2 months on the Arctic, on the ice, and next year, also to the Arctic Ocean. But everybody has sending some questions for Ben. Dear Ben, when are you most frightened and why?
Wow. I think that first day when I was dropped off was huge. That sort of utter moment of utter commitment. I remember that being a very scary moment. Even before we landed, part of it, I was 26 at the time, and I remember looking out of the window at the other helicopter thinking, these 2 helicopters are here because of me, because this dream that I had, and I've got a sledge and a skis and a satellite phone. Part of me felt like James Bond, like, how cool is this? And part of me thought, what have I done? What have I set in motion here? This is way too late to back out now. So that was pretty frightening, setting off. And the first few days are always tough, and then it starts to get easy when you get in the routine. I've fallen through the ice a couple of times. That's more frightening, I think, than seeing a polar bear. I've been attacked by a polar bear in 2001. We had a Russian shotgun that jammed 5 times before we could fire a shot in the air to scare it away. So there have been many frightening moments.
And when you are getting up in your expedition, how do you manage that kind of things when you're afraid for something? Because you know that there's not going to be a rescue in 24 hours.
Yeah. It's keeping that motivation going. Every morning I'd sort of wake up, I'd open my eyes and I'd think, oh, I'm here again. Oh no, and sort of getting up and taking, the tent was my little bit of safety and warmth, and sort of dismantling that and packing the sledge and setting off again into the unknown was always difficult. Part of it was just sheer, I think, pride and stubbornness. I knew I couldn't give up without a good enough reason. And there were many days when I wished I could fall over and break my leg or fracture my wrist or something that would give me a good excuse to phone for an aeroplane with my pride still intact. So there are enormous sort of mind games going on. Did God play a role? Wow. I'm not religious in the slightest, actually. I've had some, as I said, some pretty difficult situations up there, and particularly being on my own, it's a strange. Sounds depressing to say that I didn't feel like there was anyone watching out for me, but actually it was the reverse. It was very empowering. You feel it's an enormously humbling place to be, the Arctic Ocean, and you see nature at its rawest and most powerful, and you're completely out of control.
Yeah.
Here if it's wet, well, that's fine. You can go indoors or put an umbrella, or if it's, if it's too hot, you can turn on the air conditioning. But out there, it's massive, and you can't affect it.
Yeah.
So it's a wonderful place to go and reflect about these things. But I'm not religious, no.
And do you think that for the second question is God playing a role for that? Or
Yeah, I don't think so.
Because you're really alone and.
It's
in the spirit with yourself.
I remember I'm not religious in the conventional sense. No, not at all. And I remember a few days. I had about 4 days of very bad weather, so complete whiteout. Skiing through sort of cloud and mist, and this peculiar feeling of I knew that I was the northernmost person on the entire planet by a long way. Yeah. And everything else was happening south. The poverty and the disasters and the famines and the corruption and the crime and the murders. It was all south, and I was in a cloud at the top of the world. Now it wasn't quite the same perspective as you get from orbit, but it was close, and it's a wonderful place to reflect on what's important.
And you're working the whole day. For the second question, what are you doing the other 14 hours of the day?
Yeah, pretty busy actually. I think people imagine that it's quite relaxing, nowadays. Surely you've got an iPod or you can watch DVDs or something. I'm actually, there's, as soon as I stop, I've got to put the tent up. I've got to find snow that I can melt to get drinking water. I get in my sleeping bag, start melting snow. The cooking takes ages. There's always stuff that needs. You get very good at sewing. There's always stuff that needs repairing. Everything gets damaged. I make phone calls to my team. We update the website. And eat, sleep, and then get up and do it again.
All right. And what do you think about everybody who is for gas and that kind of things? All the.
I've just seen the last one.
The last one question. Okay. Well, why not?
Well, the first one. Did I notice? I've seen, in fact, in recent years, certainly in the north of Canada, that there are. Military bases springing up in Resolute Bay. There's a big army base now. Just tiny little villages, hamlets in the middle of nowhere that suddenly the army, Canadian military, are building huge bases. So things are changing pretty quickly in the high Arctic. As far as team members, who knows?
Could be
Send me Ben at bensaunders.com. I wouldn't rule anything out.
And when you're back, how does that feeling?
The transition is incredible. I live in London, so it's about as far removed as you can get from the middle of nowhere in the Arctic. And for the first few days, it's like watching a TV with everything turned up too far. The volume, the brightness, the color, everything is overpowering because there's so little stimulus on these expeditions. And then after that, you start to tune back in. People, if I've been alone for a long time, people are always fascinating. I would do everything that you're not supposed to do in London. I would smile at people on the tube. I would start conversations in the queue at the bank. And I've had more near-death experiences, getting back to the city and being run over and all these things than I ever have in the Arctic. So.
All right, I think that's the last question for now because the time is running out.
Cool. Thank you.
Great.
Cheers.